morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Memorial Day, Monday, May 25th, 2020. So whether you're listening to me live right now or later on in the archives, I hope you are having or have had a wonderful holiday weekend long and being able to spend some time doing something positive for yourself. Thank you for joining me one way or the other. On this episode, I want to share with you two very common errors, very common and very dangerous errors that we hear people make about the 10th Amendment and the Constitution, primarily on how to read the Constitution. I think they're very problematic, and they lead to more centralization of power, or as the founders called it, consolidation, and less liberty in the long run. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Quick programming note, I'm actually moving my apartment. I'm moving to a new apartment this coming week, so I'm going to be taking at least next week, Monday, June 1st off, and then possibly the following Wednesday, just depending on how things are going. So if you don't hear from me or you don't see a video or an update, you'll know why if you listen to this episode or watch this episode. So find all of the channels that we're on, all of the live streaming video channels, the archive video channels. We have audio-only podcast edition, all the archives to our shows. Each episode, I include links to things to read more. I'm going to have links to letters, for example, today in this episode from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, because they say so much that we need to learn that most people have not paid attention to. So you can find that. You can also find ways to follow us, like our social media channels, our email newsletter, and even ways to support us, like our membership program, which starts out as little as $2 a month. You can find all that information and more at the show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/no, that's the membership. I'm giving you guys an advertisement. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty spelled out. Just going to take a quick look in the live chat and say hello to everyone. I appreciate you joining me live. Essential Freedom, good to see you, buddy. Leslie Goody, good afternoon. Good to see you as well, Leslie. Clay Davis, Shane Lackey, Vivian Venecia, Riv County Fireman, Heather Rossi. Hi, Heather. Matthew Tandle in Texas, Jane Stetz Peterson, and everyone else, whatever platform you're on, live, archive, now, later, whenever. It doesn't matter. I'm just very grateful for you spending some time with me and your willingness to hear what I have to say. Oh, Chris Snyder and Shane Lackey, moving on to the east side. I'm actually moving. I move east every time I move, every few years here in LA, but I'm moving 6 blocks west on the same street. I also want to say hi to Keith Redman in North Carolina over on Periscope. That's pretty cool. D. Jenkins and Larry Clark. And I apologize if I missed anybody. Let's first start out. I want to point out that most of the times that I cover errors about the Constitution, how to read it in law, the original legal meaning given to us by the founders from the Philadelphia Convention, and then given legal force, the understanding that gave it legal force from the ratifiers, the people of the several states. Usually when I talk about errors in that, I'm talking about the so-called experts, the politicians, the bureaucrats, the lawyers, the people blogging on TV, YouTube, blah, on and on and on, because the stuff that they're pushing for often happens, whether now or in the future, and almost everything that all of these people push for is a violation of the Constitution as given to us by those founders and ratifiers. But today I'm going to cover what, as I said at the beginning, two very common errors that we see. In fact, they're so common. When I say common, I don't mean just like once in a while. I will literally see, hear, read, get comments, get emails about this all day, almost every day. And it's happened like this for years. But the problem that I think is that most of the people that we hear making these errors, I mean, of course, the experts and the politicians make all kinds of errors because they all suck. And I say experts in quotes, but a lot of times these two that I'm going to go over today are made by people who are actually friends of the Constitution and liberty. They'll tell you they support the Constitution. They get a lot of things right. But when it comes to these things, it's consistently bad. And I think for that reason, in many ways, it makes these errors much more problematic, because if even the supporters of the Constitution are reading it incorrectly, what are we going to expect from the other people who have no interest in reading it correctly or only to use it as a bludgeoning tool against their political opponents? So let's get into it. First of all, the first error that we see in practice, people actually misdefine the words constitutional and unconstitutional. Now, if you were to ask just about anybody, what does the word constitutional means? Or what does the word unconstitutional means? Almost everybody would get it right. I can't imagine many people not. I mean, some people might say, well, it means what the Supreme Court says it means. There's going to be people out there that say that the Constitution means what the Supreme Court says it means. But if you really press even them on it, in general, they understand, at least when they verbalize it, they understand the word constitutional as something that is authorized by the Constitution, when government is acting within the bounds of the Constitution. And you ask them about unconstitutional, they'll eventually say, well, that's stuff that they're not supposed to be doing. And it really is pretty straightforward. But when it comes down to a debate about a policy, a goal, a politician, a political party, a current proposal, something that's been done, something that might be done in the future, all of a sudden the logic and the basic understanding of these two words go out the window. And then all of a sudden, they, in practice, based on their actions and how they respond to things, they define the word constitutional as stuff I support. And they define unconstitutional as stuff I oppose. They're misconstruing because the Constitution doesn't always fit with your political goals. It doesn't always authorize or authorize things that you want government to do. It doesn't always prevent things that you want government to stop doing or not doing. You almost never hear people say things like, you know, we really got to do this. We got to pass this Affordable Care Act. It's totally unconstitutional, but it's such an emergency that it has to happen. No one makes that case. Everyone tries to shoehorn their own political goals, their own political impact, their policies, their preferred policies into the Constitution. And so because of that, what you end up having is people like just making twisted, absurd definitions or explanations about power delegated to the federal government under things like the Commerce Clause, the General Welfare Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, and the like. And in fact, we were warned that politicians would do this, whether it was Patrick Henry down in Virginia or John Williams up in New York. We were told, John Dickinson in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, we were told over and over, and I'm paraphrasing all three of these men, they were basically saying, like, look, ingenious men, ingenious politicians, people who thirst for more power will always come, and this is closer to John Williams up in the New York Ratifying Convention, ingenious men will always come up with ingenious reasons to give an opposite construction to the same clause. And that is exactly how this type of thing plays out. Now compare this to someone like Thomas Jefferson. We often think of Thomas Jefferson as being opposed to the central bank. And in 1811, he wrote a letter to Thomas Law talking about this. And so it operated for 20 years at that point. Jefferson opposed it in 1791 in his opinion against the Constitution, or opinion on the constitutionality of a national bank. You can look that up. 1791, I think December or February or so, that one came out. And he focused on the 10th Amendment. This is not a power delegated to the federal government. But we learned later on in 1811, was Jefferson just opposed to the idea of having banking like this? Here's what he said to Thomas Law. He says, the idea of creating a national bank, I do not concur in, because it seems now decided that Congress has not that power. So he's making the statement that we all expect from Thomas Jefferson, that is, I oppose or I do not concur with creating a national bank. And he had said it 20 years earlier that the federal government is not delegated a power to charter a bank, to operate a bank, period. So he's consistent about that over the years. Now, I'm not sure if this was a change of heart over time or if this is how he felt all along. And maybe someone who's researched this particular view of Jefferson would understand it better than I. Someone like Kevin Gutzman, who wrote the great book, Thomas Jefferson, I think Revolutionary. I forget the name of the book, but it was amazing. It actually made me cry at the end. Or Dave Benner, who's done a lot of great work for us at TAC and has also done a lot of amazing research on Jefferson and others. So he says, I oppose this. I don't concur in this bank because Congress doesn't have the power. He says, although I sincerely wish they had it exclusively. Can you imagine some politician today actually saying, I oppose this policy because I don't want the federal government, because I don't believe the federal government should do it. I oppose mass warrantless surveillance only because it's not authorized by the Constitution. But I wish it was, and I'm going to work to get an amendment to repeal the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. No, instead what they do is they shoehorn their own political beliefs and they change the word constitutional into stuff that I support. And summing this up on Jefferson, even though Jefferson supported the idea of having a national bank in theory at that time, he still opposed it in practice because he believed it violated the Constitution. We don't hear that from many people ever. Anything someone supports, they're always telling us how it fits within the Constitution. It doesn't matter what it is. It can be the most out there power from Space Force, for example. And we'll always hear how constitutional it is, and they'll start from that as the foundation. We can also look to James Madison for an example, and I've covered this on this show before, but it is always worth repeating, and this is from an article that was published by Dave Benner back in March of 2017, and he writes, on the last day of his administration, March 3rd, 1817, President James Madison vetoed the Bonus Bill of 1817, a plan that called for the federal construction of various roads, bridges, and canals throughout the country. We would call this an infrastructure bill. I know there are a lot of calls for a $2 trillion infrastructure bill. I mean, the numbers are mind-boggling. But Madison vetoed it, and he explained to Congress why. And Dave actually considers this to be Madison's most important of all the things he ever wrote in his history. And Dave puts it this way: Madison's reasoning was simple. Although he personally favored the idea of infrastructure construction, writing that he was, quote, not unaware of the great importance of such thing, he denied the policy's constitutionality on a federal level, so he vetoed it. When was the last time you saw a president veto something that they actually wanted to see done, but took the position that it was unconstitutional? Maybe it was James Madison. I'm not sure if anyone since then. I don't know the history of presidential vetoes. Maybe James Madison was the last one or one of the few or only who's ever done this. But it is an incredibly principled position, because if you take an oath to support the Constitution as the executive, or as any politician anywhere, if you take an oath to support the Constitution, it doesn't matter if you want something different. And if you do want something different, you just explain why, or you explain how to get there. And Madison did that. Dave goes on in his article. He says, instead of upholding his own personal proclivities and allowing the Constitution to be undermined, he maintained that the Constitution was one of specific enumerated powers, and the document contained no express power for the federal government to do such a thing. He put it this way. This is Madison. The legislative powers vested in Congress are specified and enumerated in the 8th article of the 1st article of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. And Madison writes, it does not appear that the power proposed to be exercised by the bill is among the enumerated powers. He wanted to exercise that power. He thought it was right, even though he was leaving office. It's not like he just wanted power for himself. He could have literally just signed it and said, you know, this was so important for the country, I'll just sign it and let it be done. But his last act, he actually vetoed something that he supported in theory. Going further, Madison said using the Commerce Clause, General Welfare Clause, and Necessary and Proper Clause for justification for this law, quote, would be contrary to the established and consistent rules of interpretation, as rendering the special and careful enumeration of powers which follow the clause nugatory and improper. He says an alternative view, basically twisting any of these clauses, starting out by saying, well, I really want to do this. Let's figure out how it fits within the General Welfare Clause, or let's figure out how it fits within the Commerce Clause. And these days, what they'll do is they'll go to Supreme Court opinions over and over and over, or one little quote here and there, and they twist it out of place, and they make it into something it never was. But Madison said an alternative view would have the effect of giving to Congress a general power of legislation instead of the defined and limited one hitherto understood to belong to them. Dave writes further, he says, believing that the power to build the infrastructure the bill called for, quote, cannot be deduced from any part of it without an inadmissible latitude of construction and reliance on sufficient precedents, Madison said, I have no option to withhold my signature from it until, and I'm paraphrasing, the addition of a constitutional amendment that allowed for the authority. So that's how you should approach things when you look at the Constitution and something is not authorized that you want them to do. So if you want the federal government to have more power, I would argue against that almost every single time. I can't even imagine asking the largest government, the largest empire in the history of the world, by far, it's not big enough. We need them to have more power. I would never ask for that. But if someone wants to do that, at least they're following the Constitution, and we can have that debate based on principles and structure that the founders and ratifiers gave to us. And so that is a very, very important principle that we really just don't follow, or so many people don't. And when you start with this wrong foundation, this foundation that constitutional means what you want it to mean, or means what you support, and unconstitutional means what you oppose, trying to shoehorn the Constitution into whatever personal political goal you have, you're going to have all kinds of twisted arguments. And that's what Madison opposed. I encourage you to read this entire veto message. Again, Benner thought it was the most important thing that Madison ever wrote because of this. I will link to it in the show notes. It has Dave's introduction to it, and then just below it, you'll see Madison's entire veto message. It's just, I don't know, what is it? 1, 2, 3... It's 4 long paragraphs. It'll take you like 10 minutes to read this whole thing, and I really, really encourage this. And I actually see this particular view, this particular approach happen with pro-constitutionalists, and I've thought about it. I've really racked my brain about this for a long time. Like, why would constitutionalists actually take this approach on anything? Why would they do this at all? And I think it's because when you have an attachment to the Constitution, you want to be seen as a supporter of the Constitution. You don't ever want to point out that, well, I support stuff that's unconstitutional. And so I think there's kind of a knee-jerk reaction to immediately saying, well, everything I support is constitutional and everything I oppose is unconstitutional. So that's number one. Number two, if I can get this thing to work properly, hopefully I'm not cutting out the video. It looks like I am on the screen here. Going further, number two is people don't research the Constitution at all. They literally talk about things in the Constitution. They talk about powers delegated to the federal government, what it can and cannot do, without ever researching it at all. In short, they basically make stuff up. So how do you determine if something is constitutional? Let's start out with James Madison. There's actually 3 steps. I mean, you could combine them into 2. The first thing comes from Madison in his report of 1800. This was talking about the Virginia resolutions of 1798, explaining the opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts signed by John Adams that year. And Madison put it this way, quote, "Whenever a question arises concerning the constitutionality of a particular power, the first question is whether the power be expressed in the Constitution. If it be, the question is decided." So the first thing that you do, if you're wondering whether the federal government can do something or not, is you literally read the Constitution. Now keep in mind, it's not a really long document, so it's pretty easy to get through. I should have actually pulled up a link to that. Maybe I'll include that in the show notes as well, because it's important for people to actually look at the exact text. And Madison says the first thing you do is, look, if you see it expressly listed there, then the question's settled. Now, if you don't see it, that doesn't mean it's also settled. There's other things like the necessary and proper clause. You have to understand how this all plays out. But Jefferson gives us the second step. And he says, on every question of construction, how to view the powers delegated to the federal government and reserved to the people of the several states, on every question, not most of them, not some of them, carry yourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. I got to thank Mike Meharry for pulling that up. I know it's probably a day off for Mike, but I was like, I couldn't remember where this quote came from. And this was a letter to William Johnson, June 12th, 1823. And so I texted him this morning, I'm like, hey man, can you help me find that Jefferson quote about figuring out the construction of the Constitution? And so he was kind enough to get back to me in like 10 minutes or so. And he gave me another one from Madison here in a moment. So again, let me just reiterate. I'll put this in kind of layman's terms. When you're looking at when you're looking at whether or not the federal government can do something, for example, when you're looking at the Constitution in general, when you're making a case about the Constitution, you just go back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. You don't just make up things and squeeze things out of the text. That's what Madison was talking about in his veto of the bonus bill. Of course, you could probably come up with an argument under commerce, general welfare, or necessary and proper, but that's not the right way to do it. And Jefferson reiterated this as well just a few years later. Instead, you're going to go back to how the people understood it when they ratified it. You look at the debates in the Philadelphia Convention. You look at the ratification debates, whether it's Pennsylvania or Virginia or New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and elsewhere, North Carolina, all of them. And you figure out what the people understood these clauses to mean. You don't try to make the clauses fit what you want them to mean. You do the research. Because if you don't do the research, you're literally just making stuff up. And sometimes you may get it right, because some of the stuff is actually pretty logical. But you're not always going to get it right. James Madison goes a little further. And the following year, he sent this letter to Arthur Lee. And this was also thanks to Mike Maharrey for actually giving me the link to this one. This was June 25th, 1824. And Madison says, I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. 100% on board with that is the so-called father of the Constitution. Resort to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. So if you're making an argument about powers of the government, whether it's state, federal, whatever, and you actually don't look to how the people of the day understood it, the odds of you actually getting it right are pretty low. And that means we've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of reading to do, a lot of research, and I know there's probably some groans out there like, I don't want to look at this. I just want to read the text and come up with my own approach. What sounds the best? And I'll tell you how I used to screw this up too. In that sense alone, Madison writes, it is the legitimate Constitution. The only way the Constitution is legitimate is by understanding the sense in which it was adopted and ratified by the people in the nation, by the people of the several states. He says, and if that be not the guide in expounding it, there can be no security for a consistent and stable more than for a faithful exercise of its powers. So if you can always just change the definitions or change it to fit what you want rather than like a legal document. So like any legal document, the words of the Constitution, which is an 18th century legal document, they have the same meaning today as they were understood to mean at the time. So if you and I signed a contract that says, I don't know, I got to come up with something. You're going to shovel snow for me. I don't have snow anymore, thankfully. I grew up in Wisconsin, but I had a lot of it as a kid. You're going to shovel snow for me from January through March, and I'm going to pay you a flat rate every month. Now, 50 years down the line, the owner of the property has taken on this contract, or maybe just 2 years later, there's a snowstorm in May. And I'm like, well, I mean, it's pretty obvious that snow needs to be shoveled. And you're under contract to do this for the same flat fee that I paid you. This is twisting the definition. Obviously, we had an agreement that was in effect at the time, and shifting it to mean something else because changing times, that's what they call today the living, breathing Constitution. And really, a living and breathing Constitution is a dead one because it doesn't have any consistent and stable limits. And that's how Madison put it in this 1824 letter. And he also talks about understanding the meanings of the words. And Madison himself explained to us. So when I talk about using definitions of the time, definitions, both lay and legal dictionaries, to understand what the words in the Constitution mean. Not a modern dictionary, because words change over time. Like, for example, post roads. Most people today would think that post roads are any road that the post office drives over. But the founders understood post roads as being basically interstate highways. They were larger thoroughfares that connected like different cities, and they were marked by mile markers, posts. These were post roads. So if you get the definition wrong and you use a modern definition to explain an 18th century legal document, you're basically authorizing the federal government to have power over every single road in the country. And that's totally wrong under the original Constitution. So Madison, in his letter to Arthur Lee, he puts it this way. He says, if the meaning of the text be sought in the changeable meaning of the words composing it, It is evident that the shape and attributes of the government must partake of the changes to which the words and phrases of all living languages are constantly subject. Wow, these dudes were really, really smart. They were forward-thinking. They knew that in the future, the definitions of the words in the legal document that they gave life to, I mean, they gave legal force to is really the right way to put it. I'm wrong to say life because that leads towards living and breathing. But what they gave legal force to, what they drafted, what they helped ratify, what they debated, if people in the future, like now, for example, were to just apply modern definitions to words used at the time, then it would change the actual structure of the government over time. And Madison warned us about this. Again, the government must partake of the changes to which the words and phrases of all living languages are constantly subject. What a metamorphosis, Madison writes, would be produced in the code of law if all its ancient phraseology were to be taken in its modern sense. You have to understand the words of the document as understood at the time. And this is part of what people don't do. They really don't research what these, I know you guys do because I talk about this all the time, and I recommend dictionaries and things like Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, somewhere around like a 1790 edition, late 1780s is a good one because it didn't change that much. A lot of people want to use a Daniel Webster dictionary in like 1820 or something, but this is decades after the Constitution was ratified. So maybe some of the words were actually changed over those decades, those years. And it could mean that the federal government has different powers, just like what Madison was warning about here in the 1820s. I don't think he was talking about Webster's dictionary specifically, but that is exactly how it plays out in practice. So just what a metamorphosis would be produced in the code of law if all its ancient phraseology were to be taken in its modern sense. And he actually goes on in this letter to talk about one example, and he was talking about consolidation. He says not to look further for an example, take the word consolidate in the address of the convention prefixed to the Constitution. It then and there meant to give strength and solidity to the union of the states. That's what it meant at the time. In its current and controversial application, it means a destruction of the states by transfusing their powers into the government of the Union. And we've seen that happen all along ever since. Jefferson and many others warned us about consolidation, centralization of power, but that's not how it was used, as Madison points out early on. Now, I used to skip these steps myself. I used to not actually do the research, and I thought I was really smart. When I first started the organization, I did some really good work, but I did some really bad work too. I was learning as I was going. And one example that I can give you guys is how I skipped over this process, this three-step process to understanding, researching the Constitution before making a case and sharing it with the public and trying to convince others that it's right. And it was wrong, was that the 13th Amendment prevented the military draft. Look, I think today, I agree still that the military draft, the idea of government conscription, this is involuntary servitude. It's slavery in some form, because you're forcing people to work whether they want to or not. Now, some people we can have an argument over that, but that's how I look at it. So I wrote this article talking about how the 13th Amendment banned the military draft. But that is not what it meant. No one ever made the case that that was how it was supposed to be approved. And I just started out with my own personal goal. I didn't actually look up the debates over that amendment. I didn't understand what the people understood the words to mean when they were giving it legal force when the amendment was ratified. And I just went with my own personal policy preference and then said, well, the federal government has this power or doesn't have this power. And it was totally incorrect. And I do my best to avoid that type of thing. It's actually kind of difficult. We all have a propensity to get what we want, but we have to understand that the Constitution doesn't always give us what we want. Another prominent example was for many years, I would hear things like primarily from conservatives, that they opposed, and I think this came out of the Gonzalez versus Raich case, because Justice Scalia was opposed to someone growing a cannabis plant in their backyard, 6 cannabis plants in their backyard, growing it in their home, never buying or selling it, never crossing state lines, and somehow this was interstate commerce and something that the federal government could prohibit completely. And a lot of conservatives for many years were actually on board with this view, but we've heard less and less over time. Basically, this is one positive thing. And I think it's because a lot of the propaganda turned out to be nonsense propaganda. And we hear now from a lot of conservatives something like, well, I don't support using it. I don't use it. But the Constitution, this is a state's issue. This is what the people of each state can do. And I think just doing what you're supposed to do, following your goals, whether other people tell you can or can't. Maybe I'm encouraging some wrong steps here. I'm not sure. But I think over time, people learn to take a different approach. So I am hopeful that this type of thing can shift. And maybe this will lead to another episode. I'm actually thinking about doing this regarding the Bill of Rights. This is actually one we could hear 50 times in a day. And this is from a guy, Chris, who I think is totally supportive of our work. We've engaged with him on Twitter many times. He shares a lot of our information and memes and links. But he's basically saying, let's not forget that rights are not conferred to us by the Constitution, but are in fact our inalienable rights, which is absolutely correct. Without a doubt, rights are not gifts from government. Rights are natural rights. And no government is supposed to violate them. But where he goes off the rails, and I know that this is literally made up, because I have studied and I have read through the Philadelphia Convention. I have read through a lot of the state ratifying conventions. And there is zero evidence. No one ever took this position. He says, I believe it was a requisite for state constitutions to concur with the federal Constitution as a condition of admittance to the Union. And this is absolutely not the case. There is no evidence of it. And I think I'll do a follow-up episode. If you guys are interested in this, on the fact that the founders did not originally consider the Bill of Rights to be applicable to the states, I was thinking of doing that on Wednesday or maybe sometime next week after I get back. If you're interested in that or have another show idea or suggestion, I would love to hear about it. Let me see if I can actually get this working again. Okay, there we go. I think I got my transition. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. It's more of a rant. It's kind of a casual holiday. I hope you find it educational. I hope you find it interesting. If you support what we're doing, make sure to smash the like, hit the share button, subscribe, get notifications. Reviews on iTunes are very helpful. All these free actions that you may be able to take, they all trigger the algorithm of a platform you watch or listen on, and it tells the platform to show the program to more and more people. Looking over in the live chat, let me see if there's any interesting questions. Gerard Hay says, draft and like taxation without representation and citizens not being owning land created forced labor slaves of it all. And I agree in principle that the draft is morally reprehensible. But that doesn't mean that just because I agree with it, that the federal government is prevented from doing it through the 13th Amendment. There could be another argument that could be made. Kyle Reese points out that Daniel Webster thought conscription was unconstitutional. He did. He made it and Webster was a very hated centralizer of power, especially during the abolition of slavery, during the Underground Railroad, during Northern nullification of the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. They couldn't stand the guy up in the North, especially in places like Syracuse, for example. But he made the case that it was the duty of the states to, in essence, interpose. He said to interpose from the people against the federal government to stop their militia from being conscripted into federal service and especially sent into a foreign country like Canada. Going a little further, I appreciate that. Appreciate that, Kyle. R.C. Andrews says, I will post and repost this until I am dead. Oh, yeah, so I was going back to the notion that ingenious men will come up with ingenious ideas to come up with different constructions of the same phrase. This is one that I really should have been thinking of. Thank you, RC, for pointing this out. How strangely will the tool of tyrants pervert the plain meaning of words? That's Samuel Adams. I forget what year that was done. But if you got a link to it, I will look that up and see if I can include that as well. Anyways, I think I will go back and look at the comments a little bit later today. I don't get a chance to reply to every single one of them, but I do appreciate all the feedback. And again, if you've got suggestions for future episodes or you want to hear about whatever, you got questions about this, you can leave them in the comments or you can email me team@10thamendmentcenter.com. And of course, if you support the show and you really want to pitch in, you can do so financially for as little as $2 a month. I see a bunch of people who are members, who have been in the past, who are currently, and I'm grateful for every buck. We make it go a long, long way. You can support us at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much for being here. And I hope you have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Reminder again, I will be off specifically on Monday the 1st and possibly on the 3rd next week. But for now, I'll see you on Wednesday here on the Path to Liberty.